Welcome to Pop Culture Retro, which was recently voted the 15th best podcast by the residents of the Golden Years Retirement Community in Boca Raton, Florida. Each show, we'll revisit some of your favorite pop culture memories with insider and outsider perspectives. Now, please help me welcome your hosts, Ike Eisenmann and Jonathan Rosen.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of Pop Culture Retro. I'm one of your hosts, Jonathan Rosen, with Ike Eisenmann. And today we are thrilled to welcome someone who was nominated for multiple Emmy Awards, has a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, is the founder and president of the William Holden Wildlife Foundation, has starred on both stage and screen, is the author of the memoir, One from the Hart, and one of the stars of the very popular TV series Hart to Hart. Please help us welcome Stefanie Powers. Stefanie, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jonathan and Ike. Hello.
Hello.
Well, you've had such a great career, and we have a lot to cover. But to start with, we normally ask people if they came from a theatrical background. You did. So your mother was very involved in the theater, and she pushed that love onto you?
No, she loved the theater, and she was a great devotee of ballet and all, and but she wasn't a part of the theater. No.
But she gave that love onto you?
Well, because we always had classical music playing. She took me to ballet class because I was dancing around the house, and she bought me my first pair of toe shoes, which is about this big. I have them mounted on my wall, my first toe shoes. And ballet and dancing was the thing that I loved the most as far as any idea of performing. And, but I had two loves as I was growing up: archaeology and ballet. Now, the archaeology came into my life because a friend of my mother's gave me a very thick book for a kid to have, but it was called God's Graves and Scholars, and it's one of the quintessential books on archaeology, and certainly archaeology in Egypt and in Mesopotamia, and it was better than any fiction I could have read. And all I wanted to do was go out and dig in the desert. And so that was, academically, that was what I loved. History, and I loved all the stories about, and I still do. I'm a devotee of history and reading, because I find it puts all the pieces of the puzzle together, and every once in a while you discover and yet a new piece of history, because there's so much we don't know that fits into a little niche and makes a whole picture out of something that was an incomplete impression.
Well, who were some of your performing influences growing up?
Well, like every young lady that was going to ballet class, the movie The Ballet of the Red Shoes was, for all of us little kiddies, I can still hear the music. I can, and Maura Shear was the quintessential ballerina in those days.
Well, so early in your career, you started into the old studio system of being, a contract player. So how did you first get discovered and land there?
Well, first of all, let me paint a picture of what it was like to grow up in this town. It was a very, very small town. And to say that everybody knew everybody, and it was almost that much of a small town. Because it was an industry town as well. Everybody knew somebody who worked at the studios in one capacity or another. Very dear friend of my mother's was the private secretary to Samuel Goldwyn. So you see, it wasn't so far away from us. It wasn't this, oh, I was probably, God, I must have been, I think, about 7 or 8 when I first went in onto a studio lot. It wasn't, the idea of Hollywood being so untouchable it wasn't untouchable for us
Mm.
who grew up here, because it was right around the corner, or it was down the street, or you knew somebody who was making a movie. And when I was taking ballet class, uh, constantly there were people coming into class like Leslie Caron, Jean Mayer, everybody who danced, Debbie Reynolds would come into this professional class for professionals, and at noon on Saturdays, and it was kind of a who's who of the dance world. So that too was very much, you know. So I used to go. I have a very good dear girlfriend. When I was 15 years old, I shot up to my current height, and I got breasts, which was absolutely unacceptable for a ballerina.
Oh my goodness.
So
Okay.
that really was the end of my ambitions for the ballet. And you know how you can usually at some point over a summer, you suddenly physically change beyond recognition when you're growing up. So there was a fabulous school of dance. Eugene Loring had come from New York, and he created the Western version and called it the American School of Dance. And it was on Hollywood Boulevard. And by this time, I was going to junior high school and coming into high school, first year of high school. So I was about 15. And a girlfriend of mine who was 16, who was able to drive, she had her license, at the American School of Dance, which was the first place I started studying jazz dancing as opposed to ballet, which was really fascinating. And my teacher was a fabulous dancer, choreographer called Matt Maddox, who was one of the brothers in Seven Brides for Seven Brothers.
Oh, wow.
And he was straight, so he had nothing but all these little girls panting after him. I think he had to leave the United States eventually because he had so many paternity suits. And he wound up in Paris, of all places. And many, 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 many years later, when William Holden was making a movie called Fedora in Paris, and we were together. A girlfriend of mine living in Paris, who was a dancer, said, "Let's go to Matt Maddox's class." And I did, with her. And he kept looking at me and watching me dance. And he knew I wasn't locally trained. And so he asked me at the end of the class, he said, "Now, who are you?" And I told him. And he just his jaw dropped, Not that he remembered me, but he said he did. Sweetheart, lovely. But he was still an incredible dancer.
Oh.
Fabulous line to his leg, But anyway, so because at the American School of Dance, they would post on a postal board all of the auditions that were coming into town, or the shows that were coming into town, the auditions for the shows, or for television, or specials, or movies, or what have you. Sorry. Auditions for dancers. We would go to all these auditions. She would drive, and we were tall for our ages, and certainly tall. We were tall for dancers, and so the audition would go, and I guess we were pretty good. And they'd always keep us till the end because they never look at dancers' faces; they look at their bodies, they look at their movements and all. And And the girl with the clipboard would come by and she'd take a look at our faces and she'd say, "How old are you?" And we'd stand up very tall and say, 17. And she'd get out of here, get out, you know. So with that in mind, we went to the audition for the movie West Side Story.
Mhm.
There must have been 200 dancers there. And it was obviously like lemmings. They were coming from everywhere to audition it for the possibility of being in the film. Once again, we were both kept till the end, and they didn't ask us to leave. They asked us to come back. So in total, I went to 16 dance auditions,
Wow.
and then they asked me to do a screen test. So I did 3 screen tests, and then they asked me to, go get a work permit. So by this time I had to, engage my mother as chauffeur. And because Kathy, my friend, didn't make it all the way. And we went downtown to get a work permit and she had to be on the set because you had to have a parent or guardian. Since I was just 16, I think, by the time not quite 16, because I wasn't driving. No, I wasn't driving. So I must have still been about 15. And of course, I was in high school. So I had to have a teacher on the set. And I wasn't, my part wasn't that important. I was a jet. I was Velma. But I had the extraordinary experience of working for Jerome Robbins for almost 2 months. It's about 6 weeks. And with all those dancers and with his techniques and with his idea about how the dance had to be motivated, how it was an acting class. And while I was at the studio, I met someone who was an actor turned, he loved to make his own movies, and his name was Tom Laughlin, who then became famous because of a movie called Billy Jack. But Tom was casting his own little film that he was going to shoot in Madison, Wisconsin, and with a lot of his old buddies because he'd gone to school in Madison, Wisconsin. So anyway, making a long story short, I met him in the commissary at Sam Goldwyn Studios. It was a tiny commissary, and everybody was in the same room. And somebody knew him who introduced us. And he said, "I'd like you to come and read for me." So I sort of, it was a long story, but eventually I did read for him. And just about the time that they let me go from West Side Story, he hired me.
Wow.
To act, which was something very different for me.
Wow.
That little movie, he had a patron saint. He had somebody in the industry who was a very well-known producer called Jerry Wald. And he was at 20th Century Fox. And he loved everything that Tom Laughlin did. And he tried to make him, back him. So he would show that little movie to his friends and to people in the industry. And I remember Jerry Wald and Connie Wald, their house on Beverly Drive was the first place I'd ever seen a private screening room. Well, it wasn't a screening room. It was a screen, full-size screen that came down from the ceiling. They had a very, I don't think it was a Van Gogh, but it was certainly an impressionist painting that they swung over, and there was the projector behind, and they um, they showed our movie to all sorts of people,
Wow.
not the least of which was Audrey Hepburn.
Oh my.
Because they were always having, the recognizable faces staying at their house. So Jerry Wald got me an invitation to join the contract players at 20th Century Fox and attend acting classes with a view to doing with their coach, who, by the way, was Sandy Meisner. Can you imagine?
Yes. Wow.
So every studio in those days had a drama coach who would work with all of the contract players. Sandy Meisner was at 20th Century Fox. Zena Provendy, who was a protege of um, of Stella Adler's, was at MGM, and a man called Les Mahoney was at Columbia, and he had been the artistic director of the San Francisco Rep. So they were substantial people, and they would work with the contract players, and they would also work with the potential contract players to develop a scene that they would then do for the casting director. And if the casting director thought it was worthy, that he would order a screen test, and then that screen test would be shown eventually to them in the studio, and they would maybe would or wouldn't offer you a 7-year contract.
Mm.
That's how it went.
How did you got one of your first credits? Though I saw was Experiment in Terror with Glenn Ford and Blake Edwards directing. It's not the kind of movie you associate with Blake Edwards. So how did you come into that one?
Oh, but you see, Blake Edwards had done one of the two very successful television series.
Mm-hmm.
One was called Peter Gunn, which was very much film noir, very much film noir, as Experiment in Terror was intended to be. And then also he did one called Mr. Lucky. That was, do you remember that? So he did 2 television series that were about, mysteries or crimes or something. So it wasn't really that, I know he was known for comedies, but he also, Days of Wine and Roses was his.
Oh.
He did Days of Wine and Roses just after, that was the next picture that he was doing after Experiment in Terror.
Mm.
So yes, he did Breakfast at Tiffany's, but and many other comedies, but really he was
He started elsewhere.
all around director, and fabulous, and a great mentor of mine, and I have a lot to be grateful to Blake for.
Mm. Well, you were in McClintock, which starred John Wayne and Maureen O'Hara. What are some of your memories from that shoot? And did you ever get awestruck and think I'm in a film with John Wayne?
Well, at that point I was under contract to Columbia, and they told you they owned you, so you went to the studio every day to do something or other, and you were encouraged to learn as much as possible about filmmaking. So I would spend time with the editors in the editing department and the writers in the writing department. It was really like a playground. And then they told me to go over to Paramount and go see Michael Wayne. That I had an appointment with Michael Wayne at Paramount Pictures. So I just did what they told me to do. And Paramount Pictures, Paramount was such a different looking a studio. It was quite beautiful, and these beautiful dressing rooms and everything, and they had something that we didn't have at Columbia. They had a Western Street, and I loved Western movies. I loved horses, and I grew up with horses, and it was all wonderful and exciting. And I met Michael Wayne, and then this man walked in, and sat down, and we said hello. He didn't have his wig on, so I didn't quite recognize, because Duke he'd wear like a baseball cap or something, or anything to avoid wearing his wig in real life, and his toupee.
Good.
And so we just talked, and they were very casual, and I was very casual, and we just talked about, I don't know what we talked about. And then they said, well, we've got this movie, and Columbia wants us to use you, and so here's the script. Go home and read it, and then we'll talk. So there wasn't much negotiation. The studio told me what to do. I got, we went on location, so I was contacted. I had to go to fittings for the costumes and all of that, which were rather elaborate, and of course, period costumes. And then my mother was with me because I was still a teenager. In those days, 21 was the legal age. So my mother came with me. We went on location into Arizona and had the most wonderful experience of my life.
Well, we've read conflicting accounts about this. Was John Ford there?
Yes, he was.
Good. Good.
Andy McLaughlin got sick. And it was I think I wrote about this in a book that I wrote. It'll take too much time to tell, but it's a great story about how Mr. Ford arrived on the set, because this movie was being done by all of his kids, as he really thought of everybody. Andy McLaughlin was Victor McLaughlin's son, and he had done a dozen films with Victor McLaughlin. Michael Wayne was the son of John Wayne, whose career was entirely created by, or you might say, was created by John Ford, or at least John Ford felt his career was created by him. And then Maureen O'Hara was in it, and was the co-star with John Wayne. So, and everybody was, and Bill Clothier was the cameraman, and Bill Clothier had done so many movies with John Ford, and continued to do. I mean, my favorite of all time, that the two of them did, The Searchers, is probably one of the most perfect Westerns ever made. And Bill Clothier was the cameraman. So when they were making this movie, they never consulted the man they called Pappy. I didn't call him Pappy. I called him Mr. Ford, and I tried to be out of his view. I tried to be as inconspicuous as possible, because he was tyrannical. So when Andy got sick, they called Pappy to come down and direct in his place for a few days. And we were filming on a wonderful location called the Green Ranch near Nogales, New Mexico. No, near Nogales, Mexico, near the border. And you had to go through a sort of dried riverbed, which was very, very dusty. And then you'd pop up onto a beautiful plain that looked as if it went forever. And way in the distance, almost like the scene out of Giant, when you see the house in the middle of nowhere, was this magnificent farmhouse. It's kind of classic, beautiful, white with a big veranda, and it was gorgeous. The most ideal place you could ever use for a movie. So when Ford arrived, we were all on the set, not set. We were on the set ready, made up, in costume, waiting for him to come from the airport. And they had sent a car from the set to pick him up, and he eschewed the car. He was really upset that he had never been consulted about anything.
Wow.
And so he took a taxi and followed the car to the set. And we could see, we were standing near the house, and we could see the dust coming up in the distance from the dried riverbed, and the dust and the dust and the dust. And then the cars popped up onto the plateau and drove up, and in a cloud of dust, oh, comes this taxi. And as the dust clears, John Wayne opens the door, and this leg comes out, this old dirty desert boot. And then this rear end comes out as he gets out of the car, and his khaki, safari jacket with his patch on his eye and his dirty hat. And he pushes John Wayne aside and walks over to Bill Clothier, who was tiny, and says, "Okay, Bill, let's go to work." And that was it. That's how he arrived. In the meantime, everybody's chattering, the chattering. And, he knew exactly what he wanted. He knew exactly what he was going to do. He'd gotten some notes from Andy how he was going to do it. But he had really no, whatever happened in private between he and Duke and Maureen, I don't know. I wasn't privy to that. But boy, was I intimidated by him.
So want to ask about the series. You got the lead in The Girl from U.N.C.L.E, a spinoff from The Man from U.N.C.L E. So it was a milestone for TV for being the first hour-long series to feature a female in the lead role. So the episode that introduced the character had someone else, Marianne Mobley, in the role. So how did it come to you and getting cast in the regular series?
I don't know.
Okay.
I was under contract to Columbia. I was visiting my boyfriend, who then became my husband, who was doing a movie in London called 2001: A Space Odyssey. That little movie, that little film.
That little movie.
I think that, it was such a fascinating, unbelievable, fascinating experience to be on that set, to witness a little bit of what Stanley Kubrick imagined and how innovative he was. I mean, no one who sees the movie today will ever understand the innovations that he was responsible for. Absolutely extraordinary. So it galvanized all sorts of people to come to that set, and I couldn't stay away either. And so he put us to work. So he said, rehearse the boys. So Gary Lockwood, my fiance, and Keir DeLay, I was the first voice of Hal the computer.
Oh, wow.
Because he was trying to make a point with MGM. He wanted a voice that was androgynous, neither male or female. But the studio, MGM, kept saying it sounded too gay. And so he said, all right. So he had me do the voice for a while. Then I got fired. And then he had Nigel Davenport, who was a beautiful, classically trained baritone voice. He took over, and then he got fired. And then Stanley got what he wanted, which was the androgynous voice that is in the movie, which is perfect. Which is absolutely perfect. As everything he did was. So anyway, I'm there, and I get a phone call from my agent saying, well, I have some good news and some bad news. I said, what? The bad news first. Columbia has sold your contract. Oh, to MGM. Oh dear. And what's the good news? You're going to be the girl from U.N.C.L.E. Now, in those days, I wasn't in my contract with Columbia, I wasn't allowed to do television. So there was a big distinction between a television actor and a film actor. Because when the studios who felt that they groomed their stable of of stable of stars or whatever, and their general feeling was, well, if people can see you for free, they're not going to pay to go into a theater and see you, a cinema and see you. That was the philosophy that they kept, but television was coming into its own, and it was very much becoming an entity. And I think if you look at the history of Hollywood and television, you'll see that probably the people that were most responsible for creating the template for episodic television was at Warner Brothers. William Orr and Hugh Benson were the producers of all of those amazing television series that were on 77 Sunset Strip, and also all one after the other that was produced by Warner Brothers. So MGM was not as big a producer of television as Warner Brothers was, but they were trying. And The Man from U.N.C.L.E. had been very, very successful for them. They had a few others, but the iconic ones was The Man from U.N.C.L.E. So they tried to do a spin-off of The Man from U.N.C.L.E. using a former Miss America called Marianne Mobley. Sweetest, most adorable girl. She was my neighbor. She had 2 dogs. We used to walk our dogs. That poor baby suffered from cancer for so many years. And when she died, nobody wanted to take her 2 dogs. So I took them because I knew them. And so one of them died, but I still have Marianne's other dogs.
Oh, no.
Marianne is very much a part of my life still. And we eventually, I don't know, they had a different cast. I don't know whose idea it was, but at the end of the day, I'm very happy that it was. I thought Marianne would never speak to me again, but years later we became neighbors, and so we resolved any misunderstanding. It wasn't my fault. But at the time, we didn't make anything of the fact that, as you've introduced the girl from U.N.C.L.E., that it was the first time that a woman had been the star of an hour-long television series. And I've lived all those years without knowing that or really realizing that, nor had it even been pointed out until there was a presentation on, I can't remember whether it was PBS. They had a special that they were filming, the icons or the pioneers, that's what it was, of television. And they asked me to be, and I said, well, I'm not a pioneer. What did I do? I'm just, I just worked in television. And they said, no, don't you realize that? And it wasn't until then that I even realized that indeed that was the first time that I helped break the glass ceiling. Not nice.
My gosh. Well, you had already appeared in many things at that point. Was it a different kind of pressure for you to now be the lead in a series?
Well, we worked our patooties off, It was unlike anything I'd ever done. I mean, we were boom, boom, boom. We were in every shot because, Noel Harrison and I were in absolutely every shot. and we would shoot very quickly. It was an amazing. When I look back and I think we shot 47 minutes of film in 7 days
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
with bulky technology,
Hmm.
big 35 millimeter cameras, huge arc lights, unbelievable amount of lights that you had to transport because the film was a bit slower than it is now. And it required a tremendous amount of light to be pumped in. So we had this behemoth of equipment to move every time we changed and went from one lot to the other. We would do exteriors on lot 3. We would do some exteriors on lot 2, and most of the interiors we would do on lot 1. But we had to move this circus. And on one occasion, we did 57 setups, meaning
Oh, wow.
setting a shot up with all of this equipment 57 times
Mm.
with 2 stage moves. Still got the day's work in. And today, with all the modern technology, they cannot make an hour show in less than 10 days. I don't understand that. I truly don't understand that.
Well, I do want to ask about one of the movies that I was very fond of. It was the very first thing I saw you in, Herbie Rides Again. I actually saw you in the theater. So you did a pair of Disney movies, including that one, The Boat Makes It, Herbie Rides Again. Is there a different kind of feeling working for Disney at that time? And what do you remember about the Herbie?
Well, yeah, and yes, of course there was, because the aura of Walt
Right.
Disney was still at the studio, and there still were, the everything that he established, he was an extraordinary organizer of people and obviously things, as well as being an incredibly talented creative mind. But his management of people was amazing. He had he made sure that when he built that studio, it was in the middle of nowhere. And he had all his animators um, who would go off for lunch and have to travel a distance to get to a place where they could have a drink first of all and lunch. Because the animators were always known for liking to have a wee bit of a drink. And sometimes they had a wee bit of a little bit more than a wee bit of a drink and go back. So he decided that what he was going to do is he was going to produce the best food, the best commissary for the least amount of money that he could possibly imagine. And everyone would be entitled to have one beer or one glass of wine. And it was the first studio where officially in a commissary, you could have alcohol, you could have liquor. And in addition to that, he made sure that everybody felt as if they were not just working at Walt Disney Studios, they were part of Walt Disney Studios. And everybody, whether you were the man who, served the coffee on the set, you could take home a 16 millimeter copy of any of Disney's productions except Fantasia. And you could show it to your family over the weekend.
Wow.
There were things like that that made his management and the loyalty of the people that worked there, who very much were Disney people, very much so. They supported them. And then once you had made a movie for Disney, you were in the family. And you were treated as such, and you were included when they would have events and all of that. You were included as being part of the Disney family. That was a wonderful feeling. It doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Well, we want to talk about Heart to Heart, of course. Such a great series. we were reading that the role of Jennifer Hart, they originally wanted Suzanne Pleshette, Lindsay Wagner, and
No,
even Natalie
no,
Wood. And
well,
they wanted,
yeah, it was mainly they wanted Lindsay Wagner. They had a deal with Lindsay Wagner,
Mhm.
and they thought Wagner and Wagner, heart to heart. So that's, but my two champions in this were Tom Mankiewicz, who was rewriting the original piece, which had been dusted off and rediscovered among the properties that Spelling and Goldberg owned, and it was called Double Switch originally. And everybody who knew Mank, and I knew Mank since I was a kid, we grew up together. To a certain extent, we grew up together, and um, everybody knew he was a very well known writer. He rewrote Superman, the movie that Dick Donner directed so successfully. He rewrote a couple of the James Bond movies. But he did a lot of rewriting, and everybody knew he'd come from a legacy of Mankiewicz, and not the least of which was his father, Joseph Mankiewicz, a great writer director, and his uncle, who was Herman Mankiewicz, who wrote Citizen Kane, and so all of this talent was latent in him, and everybody knew he should be a director. And Leonard Goldberg made a deal with Mank and said, "Look, I want you to rewrite this, but I want you also to direct it." And he twisted his arm, and Mank decided to direct it. And he was one of my champions. And I knew RJ because I did one of the series that he did. I can't remember if it was, though it was one was called It Takes a Thief, and the other was called what?
Let's look up here.
Anyway, I think
Yes.
the latter one was the one that I did with him, and we got along very well because, Natalie and I were in a ballet class together when we were kiddies.
That's right. So you both had such great chemistry in the series. I mean, so you felt that immediately while filming?
Yep, I think so. And we still have, he's here right now. He's in Los Angeles.
Oh,
He's going to
fantastic.
celebrate. We're all going to celebrate his 94th birthday on Saturday.
Oh, wow.
So, and we still laugh like crazy.
Well, what are some of your memories of Lionel Stander?
Oh God, I loved Lionel. I remember stories about Lionel Stander in Rome. Lionel, you know a great deal about Lionel? Do you know?
No,
You don't know.
I don't.
So at one point, Lionel was in New York, and I guess this is, he was in the movie A Star Is Born, the version before the Judy Garland version, which was I can't remember, was it made in the 30s or the 40s? Probably in the 30s. And at that time, Lionel was a very well-known Broadway actor who also was highly entrepreneurial and produced. So at one point there were something like 6 shows or something on Broadway simultaneously that he had either produced or was acting in. So he was a very substantial persona and talent in the theater, less in movies, but he made his mark as a character actor in A Star Is Born. And then Lionel, after the war, there was the offshoot of the House on Un-American Activities Committee
Hmm.
was the witch hunt by Senator
Dorothy.
McCarthy. So the McCarthy, it's interesting that the McCarthy investigations, the McCarthy committee, was an offshoot of the House on Un-American Activities investigations, which lasted for 30 years.
Hmm.
And McCarthy focused so viciously on the theater, the theatrical community, and the motion picture community. And it's interesting to read about it because we always in peril of losing our freedom of speech, our freedom of opinion, our freedom of speech,
Very
whether
true.
it's because all of a sudden some wokey ladies who know nothing about anything decide to cancel you, or they are telling you what you can and cannot say. All of those sorts of things we're in peril of losing. And indeed, that dark period in our history, which blackballed an enormous amount of people who should never have been blackballed, who were interested in investigating other ways of philosophy or thought processes. And Lionel was one of them who was blacklisted because he refused to name names of people that were suspicious, that had attended meetings. Well, my mother attended meetings. I talked to my mother about what it was like in Hollywood in those days when people would have evening salons and they would talk about something called dialectic materialism. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I'm vaguely familiar.
Yeah. Which was in fact, a propaganda for Marxism.
Yeah.
And at periods of time in the history of our country, we had, socialist movements, but because of the Russian-American beginnings of the Cold War, our government was hysterical about the influx of potential philosophies that were un-American,
Right.
allegedly. And Lionel would refuse to participate, and as a result, his testimony is legendary and is a matter of record, and you can actually probably dial it up on the internet and see it. And it's eloquent what he stated, and he was blacklisted for it. So he left. At the time, he was married to someone whose father was a very substantial member of the financial world in New York. And so as a result, Lionel wound up spending a few years with a seat on the stock exchange, being a trader when he couldn't. And then he was seduced by some spaghetti productions, by some Italian producers to come to Italy and make a few movies. He made like 50 or 60 movies in Italy during that period, when all of those kind of runaway productions, because the studio system was breaking up, and there were a lot of frozen funds in Europe. I don't know do you know what frozen funds are? Did you know anything about that? All right. Well, after the war, the Second World War, all of Europe had currency control. You could not remove currency from the country, and you couldn't transport it to another country. So you couldn't all the movies, the money that movie studios were making from the release of their films was literally frozen in the countries where they
Oh,
showed the films, where they exhibited the films. Ergo, they had bank accounts. They had huge amounts of money that were sitting frozen in France, in Germany, in
amazing.
Italy, and they needed to use up that money, which is why all these movies started to go and film in Europe, where it was also cheaper to make movies, and there were wonderful film companies who had great film, great filmmakers, very cameramen and lighting men and all of that. So that was it began to be, that transition was always,
Hmm.
probably usually safe to say follow the money. So in those days, there were a lot of productions going on with frozen funds in Rome, Cinecittà Studios, and in those days, we really did have wonderful films coming out of Italy and France and England, and those industries really were vibrant. And we had Fellini movies, and with everybody who Marcello Mastroianni was, and yet what they were subtitled, so it didn't matter because we all began to appreciate foreign films.
And by the way, the series you was Switch.
It was Switch.
Switch,
Okay, so
yes.
it must have been Switch that I did.
Right.
Anyway, so Lionel wound up being sort of the most favorite character actor American for every role that they needed him to play in Italy, and he had a glorious life. He lived with two blonde stewardesses or something, and he was the king of the Via Veneto. He had his own table reserved at one of the coffee shops on the Via Veneto, when that was the place everybody paraded back and forth on. He was quite a character. And RJ also, when RJ's career was a little stagnant, he had an opportunity to go to Italy and do some films. So he also went to Italy and he met Lionel.
Amazing. When did you first start knowing that Heart to Heart was going to be a hit? What did you, at some point, did you started feeling it yourself?
Oh boy, that took a long time. The first year we were filming, and don't forget, we made 26 episodes each year.
Right.
It's almost unheard of in today's world.
Sure.
We were working very much in a vacuum, and it was difficult, very, very difficult. We knew we had the clout of Spelling and Goldberg to keep us on the air, but we didn't have any idea of, yes, there were ratings and all of that, but we had no idea of how it would grab the public. And when it did, it was fantastic. But the first time I think we had any feedback, either one of us, was when we went on hiatus. And all of a sudden people would say, "Oh, I love your show," or oh, and it was a surprise.
Wow.
It was a surprise.
Well, how does having the lead in a hit TV series change things for you?
Well, because it was a hit for so long, the success is an interesting thing. Very few people know how to deal with it because we're all prepared and programmed to deal with failures. And we pick ourselves up and we try again and all of that. But none of us are programmed for success. So sometimes it goes to people's heads. Sometimes they act very badly and behave very badly, and as we've seen countless times. And if you're very smart, which it takes some time to understand, you realize that there's a moment of where you have some leverage. where you can make deals to do other things, such as movies for television or pilots for other series, and make certain negotiations. So that was the lesson that I learned,
Hmm.
and I was able to make a deal with CBS for an X amount of things. Movies for television, miniseries, and the pilot for another television series as and when Heart to Heart went off the air.
And looking at the show, I mean, you talked about the chemistry. What is it that you think people related to in your show, in between on that, just watching it?
Oh, well, first of all, it was such an idealized relationship.
Mhm.
You never saw, there was no kitchen sink drama. At one point, the network said, well, maybe they should have a child. And RJ said, really? So what are we going to do when we go off on an adventure? Put the baby on like a papoose and take them with us? What are we going to do with this? Not going to be a show about a baby. So nothing practical, as you
Mhm.
remember. We saw a few rooms in the house. We saw the kitchen. We saw the sitting room, the big living room area, and we saw the bedroom. We never saw where Max lived. We always used to laugh and say, well, you don't have a room, Max, you just and we always said it's very dangerous to be friendly with the Harts because you're going to eventually get killed or so it was absolute fantasy and romantic fantasy, and I think the rapport between us um, idealized a kind of relationship where two people loved each other and two people were, had the same humor and could chide each other, and it was the kind of the relationship we all want to have.
Oh, most definitely. Well,
Yeah.
there was so much humor in the show. So, were there any scenes where you guys just could not stop cracking each other up?
Oh yes. Oh, oh gosh, yes. Oh, we had a sequence on a train. I'm telling you, we had to shut down. We couldn't continue. Like kids in school, we absolutely couldn't continue. And there were two guest stars who also had the giggles, and we had to close down. We had to shut down. Go home and come back. We come back. And I mean, no, it was because don't forget, we were also in every shot. We worked 14 hours a day and sometimes 16 hours a day, and we'd get punch drunk,
Of course.
Oh, gosh, yes.
We'd get very silly.
So when the show was canceled, it just seemed so abrupt, and I was reading that it was. So did you expect it at all? And did they give you any reason?
No, no, no.
Wow.
I was in Paris. I was doing a mini series called Mistral Daughter, and we had talked about eventually doing two shows in Paris. We would do, and we said the rough ideas of the scripts, how, Freeway would fall in love with a French poodle, and it would lead us on a thing. And then another one of the shows was going to be the défilé, the during the time of the fashion shows. So we had this idea that we would be
Yeah.
continuing,
Mhm.
and it was a Sunday. I was going to go to work the next day on Mistral's Daughter, and I got a phone call in Paris from Tom Mankiewicz, Robert Wagner, and Leonard Goldberg, and they said we're canceled.
Oh my gosh.
And I mean, I think I cried my eyes out all night.
Oh, wow.
Because it was so abrupt and without any reason. And it turned out that there was a new person put in charge of programming at ABC, and he decided that he wanted to make his mark. So our ratings had gone down a bit, but he canceled 7 hours of television. We will never remember his name because ABC went from being teetering on being the #1 station to being #3 and in the basement for quite a few years until they recovered. But they certainly made the wrong choice. And it was
Always,
also about this time that Spelling and Goldberg as a company were breaking up. So that also didn't help.
always leave it to an executive to ruin a good thing.
Yeah, and more.
Yes.
Never changed. That part of it,
Right.
business has never changed.
Yeah.
The suits are the suits.
Yeah.
Well, years later, they started doing the Hart to Hart standalone movies. How did those come about, and were you excited to revisit the role?
You know, in between, RJ and I would get together occasionally, and we would do a 5-city tour of a wonderful play called Love Letters. And we opened it in London. We opened it in Canada. We took it to Hawaii. We had a wonderful, wonderful time. We did over, I guess, several hundred performances of, and we even, in Chicago, we played the Chicago Theater's one of the biggest theaters in the country. It's got 3,000 seats or something. And this tiny play with 2 people sitting on stage reciting the letters that they wrote to each other across a lifetime. We grossed $1 million in 1 week.
Wow.
It made headlines in Variety. So we had this, we stayed connected. And there was always this feeling that we needed to put a period at the end of the sentence. And so with, as a result of an entrepreneur producer who was able to wrestle away the rights, NBC had an idea, which unfortunately they didn't stick with, to create something that used to exist in the 1970s, I think it was, probably the 70s, which was called a mystery wheel, which meant that there would be 4 shows, which would all have to do with mystery or crime solving. And they would be 2-hour movies each. And you would see one of them a week, every month.
Right. Involving.
So we did 8 of them, and wound up being the only spoke of the wheel that lasted. Unfortunately, the other spokes just died off because they just didn't. First of all, they didn't realize that in order to educate the audience to understanding the wheel, and that it is all going to happen every week, that you build an audience on it, but you have to educate the audience to expect that. And the other shows did not have, they weren't remakes of something that was known. They were new shows, so they had to create their own audience. So it just didn't work. But it was great for us because we had the opportunity to put a period at the end of the sentence. And we filmed in Australia and in Germany, and
Well, they were fun movies, yes, for sure.
they were fun, weren't they?
I want to discuss your fascinating memoir, One from the Heart. What prompted you to write it?
Um, Several things. The death of my mother, my first experience with cancer, um, and uh, uh, and I guess that was it. The death of my mother and my first experience with cancer. I think I needed a catharsis, and I had been asked several times if I would work with somebody and as a ghostwriter,
Mhm.
and so they Simon and Schuster gave me a ghostwriter who was completely and utterly worthless, and I fired him. So I went to Kenya and I started writing myself, and I started writing episodes, and they gave me a very good editor. So the editor was really my salvation.
Oh, shit.
And I started writing little episodes because I had written before. I had written screenplays, but I'd never written a book. The only nomination I've ever framed, I'm looking at it right now, is a nomination from the Writers Guild of America for the best screenplay for a television movie.
Mm.
That was nice. That was a very
Sure.
nice nomination. Um, so uh, the experience was very much a catharsis. The book is imperfect, to say the least, but it served its purpose in my life, and just to set a few things down, and I think that I was able to write definitively about Bill Holden
Yeah.
in a way that showed his faults, but also showed the truth of what an exceptional man he was, and a man with an affliction, but nonetheless exceptional and iconic in my life.
Hmm. Well,
So
while you're
I was very happy to be able to write those things.
Oh, it's a fantastic book. Really fantastic book.
yeah,
You liked it? Oh, thank you.
Yeah, very much.
Thank you.
while writing it, did things come back to you that you had forgotten about?
Oh gosh, yes, yes, very much so. It is a full catharsis, you know. It's very difficult. Somebody said, "Why don't you write again?" I said, ooh, I don't know if I could go through that again, because when you're writing about yourself and not about a fictional character, you really have to dig in there, and sometimes it's not the most pleasant
Sure.
experience.
Mm.
I
Well,
never really wanted to. I never really spent a great deal of time thinking. You know, I don't look at life from what I mean to it. It's what it means to me. So
Hmm.
I'm not very much. I'm not very narcissistic. I'm just narcissistic enough. But I'm not constantly taking selfies of myself.
yeah, well put. Um, well, you mentioned Bill Holden. We want to discuss your work for animal preservation and protection, and your work for the William Holden Wildlife Foundation. So, first off, can you tell us how you met Bill to begin with?
Oh boy, that is a long story. So
Oh,
I'll just have to say
Okay.
that it's in the book.
It is in the book.
yeah.
Yes.
It's in the book.
Yes. So how did the Wildlife Foundation come about? And can you tell us the work that's done by them?
I'd love to. Bill, in the 1950s, Bill was living in most of the time in Switzerland. Bill and two friends went out to Kenya uh, in the mid 1950s to hunt. In those days, that's what people did, and game was prolific, and not everybody was able to do that sort of thing because it was a highly expensive proposition and also a great commitment in time to do what was the prize for people who hunted, which was called the Big Five. Elephant, lion, rhino, buffalo, and elephant, lion, rhino, buffalo, and I can't remember. The Big Five. Leopard.
Mhm.
So they went out to Kenya on this hunting safari at a time when the freedom fighters were all over the mountains in the north, where the hunting areas were that they were going to use. And there was a need for them to leave the camp because the camp was rather elaborate, because they could only get so many animals in any given spot of called a numbered hunting block, where they had to move the camp and then they could resume hunting in another location. So the game department was managing that they didn't deplete certain species. And every time they had to move the camp, it would take 3 days or so. And so they needed a place to go and repair themselves and actually, wind up drinking themselves into oblivion. But so they found a wonderful upcountry inn on the slopes of Mount Kenya, not realizing that in Mount Kenya there were all of these gangs of rebels called the Mau Mau, who were freedom fighters. And this beautiful house on the slopes of Mount Kenya that had been turned into an upcountry inn was for sale. And there was one other person in residence who was writing a book. His name was Robert Rourke, and he was writing a third book. And the three of them, and they would sit on the veranda looking at Mount Kenya, this beautiful glacier-covered mountain on the equator. And they would say, God, somebody ought to buy this place. And finally, Robert Rourke said, I'm tired of hearing about this, put up or shut up. So they all wrote checks, and they bought a hotel, which they eventually made into the Mount Kenya Safari Club.
Wow.
Which became the jewel in the crown of destinations for everyone who was going to East Africa.
Mm.
And eventually there were 2,000 acres that surrounded these 60 acres where the club was. And it was a mixed farm owned by a Major Nicholson. And Bill started to spend much more time in the bush, appreciating animals rather than wanting to shoot them. And he had an idea of creating a game ranch, which nobody had in those days. And he wanted to buy that land. And eventually he was able to negotiate with Major Nicholson, and Nicholson sold him this 2,000 acres for him to create this image of a game ranch for the preservation of species. He found a partner who was a young American, happened to be there learning how to capture animals with an idea that he could make collections and send them back to zoos and zoological parks in the United States. So the two of them put their heads together and created the Mount Kenya Game Ranch. And they had a capture unit, and they would bring what eventually became 37 species of East African wildlife, 5 of which are no longer visible in the wild, and created one of the most amazing refuge stocks, breeding stocks of 37 species of wildlife. The idea of building an education center was something that Bill wanted to do and constantly talked about for local people, so that they could learn about their wildlife and learn why it was important to preserve not only species, but the habitat that the species were in. So that was a natural criteria for creating an education center. And um, I was with him at the when we walked the area that was excised from the game ranch to create this 15 acres to create an education center. Unfortunately, the land was excised and intended for that purpose, but Bill didn't survive long enough to see that happen. So after his death, I formed the William Holden Wildlife Foundation as a 501c3 public charity so that we could ensure the perpetuity of this effort. We serve about 11,000 students a year coming through our
Oh, wow.
education center. And we have an outreach program in rural areas, 7 rural areas where we serve another close to 6,000 members of the community, as well as students from the schools. We decided to go through schools to reach parents as a means of attracting their attention. And we teach wildlife conservation through education programs. We've rebuilt most of those schools, so they are beautiful facilities now. And we also teach alternatives to habitat destruction, which has become something much more important, as we all know. In recovering habitat that is lost through abuse by over-chemicalized farming, as well as over-exploitation of marginal land. So we have a new laboratory, and we are involved in the pursuit of the restoration and regeneration of soils, along with the teaching of methods of farming that will produce multi-crops rather than monocrops, which leave small farmers with barren land for too long a period of time, and sometimes not recoverable periods of time, when drought can come and destroy any possibility of them feeding themselves. So we're dealing with small holding farmers, nothing more than 10 acres. And we have 7 projects where we are teaching this form of regeneration, and we are now casting our rods into the sea of academia to get the cooperation of PhD candidates to come and do their PhDs with us in this pursuit, because we very definitely need to have some acceptable and published criteria for what constitutes regenerative farming. At this point, we really don't have the scientific aspects of how you prove that you have regenerated soil and that you have regenerated farming methods. You know, when everybody was all of a sudden on the bandwagon of everything being organic, in the beginning of the rush to be organic, there were no criterias for how you proved that the food you were buying was actually organically grown. How did you prove that? What was it? Oh, just because you're not using chemicals and you're not spraying, that's not enough. You have to completely make the soil in transition in order to produce what you could call an organically produced food, because otherwise you're bringing up all the toxins from the soil unless you've cleaned the soil, or you've allowed the soil to regenerate itself, which may take 3 or 4 years. In our method, we do it faster.
Very admirable.
God, that's absolutely incredible. Yeah. Well, if people want to help or get involved, how can they go about that?
Oh, please, God, yes. We need your help. We need your support. We are a very small but lean operation. All of the overheads of our operation are covered. The cost of the overheads of our operation are covered by one donor. And so I can say to everyone that has any potential to help us by donation, that 100% of what you give us goes to the work we're doing. It doesn't pay my airfare, doesn't pay my household, it doesn't support me, it doesn't it doesn't support our office, that's a donation. It doesn't support any of our overheads. It goes right to the work that you're giving it for. So we have a website. It's whwf.org. And anything and more than you wanted to know is on that website. And
we're going to include the link as well. We're going to include the link.
We use PayPal. Yes.
Well, before we let you go, also there've been talks through the years about doing heart-to-heart remakes. Would you be up for being involved in some capacity if that were to happen?
Oh boy, it's a toughie. It's tough because heart-to-heart remakes, the heart-to-heart is based on a fantasy and an idea of romance that kind of has left our vernacular, sadly.
Yeah.
And because we have so much reality television where people speak to each other badly, or people are encouraged to speak to each other badly, romance has kind of gone out the window, hasn't it?
Yeah.
I guess you're right. Well, do you have any upcoming projects that you can tell us about?
We have. I'm monstrously involved, as you know, with the William Holden Wildlife Foundation.
Yeah.
There is a play that I have. We're playing a play we're playing with in England. It's also only a 2-character play, so I have to gird my loins to see if I can remember all those words. I've done 4 2-character plays, and it is very difficult to be on stage for 2 hours just talking, So I'm trying to decide whether or not I feel I can not only mentally and physically do it, but devote the amount of time that it would take.
Well, how can people follow you on social media?
I'm not quite sure, but I think I'm out there. I'm learning how to use social media. I've got some helpers that are doing it, and we're trying to be more visible on social media because I realize that there's a whole world of people that depend on social media for all their information, and we want to make sure that they're getting the right information.
Of course.
So I guess I'm on Facebook and Instagram, I think.
We will post those links as well. Stefanie, we want to thank you so much for joining us today. We had such a treat getting to speak with you. I definitely recommend everyone get One from the Heart. Great memoir. There are some great stories in there that we can only scratch the surface talking to you. So you're welcome back anytime. But there's some great Tallulah Bankhead stories in there as well. But I definitely recommend everyone getting it. Again, this has been Pop Culture Retro. I'm Jonathan Rosen with Ike Eisenmann. And again, a very special thanks to Stefanie Powers. And please like, comment, subscribe.
Thank you for listening to Pop Culture Retro, where no one was hurt during the making of this podcast.